Okay, so we are, hey Tower. So we are live, is that right?
We are about to go live. It's a little slow at the moment.
Okay.
Wait just a second.
Hi, John.
Huh.
Hi, Dana. How are you?
Good, good. How are you?
Good, fine, thank you.
I think my internet's just being slow. Okay, we are live.
We are live. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Environment Subcommittee members, thanks for joining. And our agenda today is basically two things: to hopefully move out some pretty straightforward Senate bills that are before us, and then also to discuss SB 737 and the Comprehensive Conservation Finance Act. I asked the advocates to be here because this is, as the name of the bill suggests, it is a comprehensive bill and number of different provisions. And since, during the hearing, I think, the advocates had a certain amount of time to present, but we need to learn more about the proposed bill. They asked Chesapeake Conservancy, which is the lead advocacy organization, for the bill to come in and present to us on it and to take our questions. So we're just going to discuss it, try to get a better grasp of it, not to vote on it or consider amendments today, but just go through the bill as best we can. So with that, Kristen, do you want to bring up the list of Senate bills for us to consider?
Did you want the agenda to be shared?
Sure.
Okay.
Sure, why don't you do that?
Okay, I didn't have it up, so I have about a gazillion other windows, and my fear is I'm gonna share the wrong thing. So
yeah, I've done that.
Oh my gosh, I already have so many windows open right now, so oh my gosh. And then Dana, I'll leave it up too. Forget about closing it down. Let's see.
Okay.
Is it showing up?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. So I guess we're going to start with Senate Bill 349.
Sure.
Okay. So Senate Bill 349 is a departmental bill that makes changes to the Maryland Drinking Water Revolving Loan Fund to conform state law to federal law. The changes include increasing the maximum term limit for loans made from the fund and increasing the maximum amount of loan subsidies that can be issued to disadvantaged communities. The bill also increases the time period after the completion of a drinking water facility when annual principal and interest payments begin. And then finally, the bill clarifies the authorized uses of funds in the fund to include uses authorized or required by relevant provisions of the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. And so that's the bill.
Okay, anyone have any questions about this bill? Yeah, Delgadado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. What other uses is that opening up, or that would be specified in the federal rules and still be focused on safe drinking water?
Yeah, it's still safe drinking water. So the types of projects relate to that. And this is really, it's still, nothing will change. It has to be in line with federal law. And so what this does is that it increases, the term limits. So I think the idea is by providing these changes, the longer loan terms and additional subsidies could make the projects more affordable to the borrowers.
Right, it looks like it's providing more flexibility in the terms of the loans that can be made from the fund. So fiscal note says no material fiscal impact on state finances. And the local effect is a meaningful benefit for local governments that have access to longer loan terms and/or additional subsidies under the bill. The changes will make projects more affordable for local governments, particularly in the long term.
I'll move favorable.
Okay, is there a second? All right, well, I'll second it. So any discussion about the bill? Or questions?
I just raised my hand to second, but I was muted.
Oh, okay. And
Sorry, I joined late, but which bill are we on? I thought, my apologies, I had this down as a 1:30 meeting, so my apologies.
no problems. SB 349,
Okay, we're on the first, okay, cool.
drinking water, SB 349, drinking water revolving loan fund.
Got it, okay.
Okay, anyone have any questions about the bill? Okay, then all those in favor of the bill say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, bill passes. Thank you. Okay, Kristen, SB 446.
Mr. Chair, would you like me to share the reprint of this bill? The bill did come over. The Senate did not amend the bill, but the sponsor did present amendments at the bill hearing. Or
Sure.
I'm with looking. I did hand them out or sent them out via email.
Why don't you share them? That'd be great.
Okay. Did my screen come up on that? Or does it still show the,
Still shows the agenda.
okay, I have to maybe close that out and then try again. All right, how about now?
Yep.
The reprint?
Yes.
Okay. All right, let me just make sure I can navigate in it. Okay.
So Kristen, you said again that the bill came over clean, but in the House hearing before us, the sponsor of these amendments.
Yeah, so yeah, that's correct. It came over clean, and from my understanding, once it came over here, that the sponsor worked with the Department of the Environment to further clarify the provisions. This bill requires MDE to create and maintain a database of supplemental environmental projects. And what the amendments do is that, let me get to that page. It clarifies that the database of supplemental environmental projects would be projects that the department may consider for implementation as part of a settlement of an enforcement action. It also clarifies that the department must solicit input from communities that are overburdened, underserved, or otherwise disadvantaged by environmental stressors. The amendments authorize the department with reasonable justification to consider a supplemental environmental project that is not included in the database as part of a settlement of an enforcement action. It indicates to the department in order to choose a supplemental environmental project that's offered by a violator, the department must approve the project and maintain documentation of the approval. And then finally, before a violator undertakes a supplemental environmental project, the department must give priority consideration to the selection of a project located in the same geographic area impacted by the alleged violation, and then ensure that the scope and cost of the chosen project is reasonably related to the nexus of the violation or the adverse impact of the violation, and the cost is sufficient to allow the department and the alleged violator to reach a settlement.
Okay. Thanks. So we do have a couple questions. First, Delegate Ruth and Delegate Otto.
Thank you. This is actually on the bill. Should I wait? It's not so much on the amendments.
Sure. Why don't you wait then? Sure.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Otto. Yeah, Delegate Otto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I take it that the amendments are giving a little more flexibility to the department to make these determinations, but still have strong restraints.
I think the amendments give flexibility. They would still have this database be created, but they're not tied to it.
Okay.
Yeah. Tower, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, sure. So the amendments will allow us to not only do projects that are in the database. So prior, we had to stick to only things that were in that database. And so if there was something directly tied to that community that might make more sense, or something that we thought might make more sense, it wouldn't give us the flexibility to do so. And also the amendments fix the provision, in our opinion, where prior it was the violator had the ability to choose what in our database they wanted to do. And so this is MDE gets to choose what that project is, not that the violator gets to pick from the list of projects.
So Tower, the database that we're talking about under this bill is sort of sample environmental remediation projects.
So yeah, that would be the idea. Before we had concerns, because if this database was to be something where a violator could pick from projects, we would have to have costs that were specific to every area. It would have to be very specific so that in every scenario there was an option to choose from, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and give us some idea of what are the types of projects that are, that might be on the list.
Yeah, there might be restoration activities would be a big one for violations. I mean, we even want to put some emphasis on tree planting, just something that can offset that violation that took place.
Okay. Or it could be conceivably stormwater related,
Yeah, so if it was stormwater, maybe a stream restoration to offset what had happened.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Delegate Boyce.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Tyler, maybe Kristen can help me answer this. So we have these supplemental projects as it relates to potentially the department's or the state's goals. Would it then go towards that too? So if I'm a violator and then I have to do this supplemental project, like you mentioned, tree planting, and suppose I'm doing a tree planting in an area that may already be tapped to have some tree planting done. Would that kind of supplement, for instance, that cost, or would it be above and beyond some of those costs? Does that make sense?
Do you mean cost to the state or cost to the violator here?
A violator, not the state. So, I mean, for instance, like maybe it's a violation in an urban area, for instance, and maybe that area, wherever the violation occurred, has a plan for trees, for instance, and maybe MDE decides, well, you know what, you now have to implement whatever, we want you to plant, X amount of trees in this area. Like, how would that then, I guess, coincide or coordinate potentially with stuff that's already happening?
I would say our hope would be that the SEP from the violator would supplement projects being carried out by the state and goals towards tree planting. And so one of the amendments that we'd even offered to Climate Solutions Now was that if we were to consider smaller poles from the Bay Restoration Fund, we would prioritize tree planting SEPs in environmental justice communities. And so
I guess that's what I'm asking for, because there's a lot of bills right now with a lot of goals. And if we have violators, then potentially not only having to remediate their violation, but if it somehow also is meeting our goals, I'm just wondering how all of this is kind of coming together and coordinating together potentially.
Yes, so we do hope that this would go towards that tree planting goals. If somebody was, I don't think we would pull these trees out of that arena, if that makes sense. I don't think we would
No,
pull
I
the
understand.
trees.
That was just an example. I'm just
Okay.
using as a smaller example of potentially using the violator to end up meeting some of our goals if the violation fits the project that they should end up having to use for remediation.
Mhm.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, I would say that yes, the project taken on by the violator to offset their violations should go towards state goals.
That's what I want to hear. Yeah.
There we go.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, great. Delgado.
Mr. Chairman, I'd move the sponsors amendments.
Okay, all right, is there a second?
Second.
Okay, any further questions about the amendments? All right, all those in favor of the amendment say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, the bill as amended. Let's see, we do have, let's see. Delgado, okay. Okay, great. All right, Delgado Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is kind of more of a fundamental question, I guess, for Tyler. So where do these projects come from that are going into the database? Are these projects already in process? Are these ones that MDE has identified as needs? Where do they come from?
Yeah, I think where we want to start with the database is looking at projects and steps that we've already had in the past, things that we've already worked on so that we have ideas of what we can do in the future. And then working with our staff to try to find maybe new ideas or new solutions. And then as we have maybe new SEPs in our agreements, add that to the database so that we just have a whole universe of what we've done and what we can do as a SEP.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Chair, can I ask a question?
Sure.
So Tyler, this is one of those help me understand questions. I take it this is a database that already exists internally that is now going to be or not?
So we don't necessarily have a list ready to go of all of the SEPs, but that is something that we actually have a internal work group where we're working to have that list and understanding. So we are working towards this.
And because I haven't thoroughly read the bill, please forgive me. This would be an internal database to help you and, well, now violators can't look at it and say, pick a project, but you would otherwise pick one for them. But is this a public database as well?
So my understanding is that it would be public because we didn't change the database. So the database was always set up so that somebody could look at the database and pick a project. It's just now we're saying that you can't pick your project. We will pick your project.
But as a resident, I could see projects and I could see, oh, you know, Von Stewart and Co. had a violation and now they're doing a project by MDE to do something, you know, over by the old Memorial Stadium. Or, you know, I could see that I could see that essentially that I could see that progress. I could see that that's happening and you have, or not you, but MDE has assigned that project to that quote unquote violator.
So I don't think we intended this SEP database to have all of that updated information.
Got it.
But that information will be in the other database that we are creating because there's another database that'll be tied to all the violations.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's a bill for that, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Okay. And then I have another question, but I'll hold it. I'll hold it.
Okay, Delgado.
Well, Regina had a question. I don't want to disrupt that, but I was going to move the bill as amended.
Okay, well, that's fine to do. And is there a second?
Second.
Okay, Regina, did you have a follow-up question? Delegate Boyce?
No, I'm sorry, I don't have, no.
Okay, well, that's fine. Just wanted to be sure. Okay, anyone have any questions then about the bill as amended? All right, all those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Okay, bill carries. Thank you. Last bill on the agenda for the voting list, SB 661. Kristen, could you summarize what that bill does?
Sure. So Senate Bill 661 and extends an oil transfer license fee. The current fee is 8 cents per barrel transferred into the state until July 1st, 2024. We've seen this bill comes in from time to time to extend the fee. The bill as drafted would then have the fee revert to 5 cents per barrel beginning July 1st, 2024. This is a fee that's deposited into the oil fund and then a portion that's deposited into the reimbursement fund for residential heating.
All right, so is it paid by, remind me, distributors, the oil?
So it's paid, yeah, I mean, it's at the first transfer.
First transfer, okay.
Yeah,
And then in the event of a spill, pays for cleanup costs, issue about reimbursement for home heating oil, some disputes about that. Guess it can be used to pay. So, okay, any amendments?
so no amendments. Oh, but you know what, there was one piece of the bill that came over from the Senate there. They did add a study language that the department study the oil fund and include, so this is on page 5, include information on the number of reimbursement claims submitted for the replacement of residential heating oil tanks, the backlog, average number of days to receive reimbursement, et cetera.
Okay, so that is an amendment we have to adopt first.
That's not an amendment. I'm sorry. It was in the amended Senate bill that I just didn't catch that. And
Oh, I see.
it's
Okay,
here before the subcommittee.
okay,
I just missed language in the Senate bill.
okay.
Kristen,
Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead,
Mr.
Delegate
Chair,
Boyd.
can I ask a quick question?
Yeah, sure.
So, so it's currently the transfer fee is 8 cents per barrel.
Correct.
And then as of 2024, it will go down to 5 cents per barrel.
Right. It would need to be
Dependent on the
If
study,
they want, pardon?
depending on the study, or regardless of the study?
No, it's not dependent on this. This is an area of law that has been extending this fee, and the reversion to 5 cents just keeps getting pushed back. So, I mean, I would expect, it's just a fee that's being revisited every, 3 years or so by the legislature to see if that fee level needs to stay the same to keep the program funding at a level that the program can operate at. So in current law, it does refer to 5 cents per barrel, but I would imagine, before the 2024 reversion, we'll see another bill to continue at least at some level this fee per barrel.
So then the next question would be, is 8 cents sufficient and does 5 cents hurt the fund?
Well, certainly reverting it to 5 cents.
Decreases the fund. I mean,
That's what's going to happen without this law. So under current law, that reversion is in place to take effect July 1st of this year. And so this law is just extending these provisions so that the 8 cents per barrel remains the fee, and then it bumps out that, reverting back to 5 cents an additional 3 years as well. So under
then-
current law, it would revert to that 5 cents per barrel without this bill.
So then in 2024, we could find out that maybe 5 cents is okay because we're using less gas because, we're electrifying, right? Or it could be that things are pretty much the same and we still need it. So regardless of whether us passing it pushes it back, but there more than likely would probably be a revisitation, especially if there's going to be a study.
Yeah, historically, it's been revisited on a regular cycle, and oftentimes the fee is more or less being continued
At
the
8
same or
cents.
similar level.
Interesting. And I think if I remember from the testimony, Ellen Valentino supported this bill.
Yes, it has industry support.
I'm sure it does. Okay. I've questioned enough. I'm sorry. Thank you.
No problem. No problem. Delegate Otto, you have your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think Delegate Boyce's questions and Kristen's answers filled most of my questions. This is just an extension of the deadline, right? It extends it
Right.
to the sunset.
That's right.
And the fees will be the same. We're not changing the use of the fund.
That's right. The only thing that's new, I guess, is a study.
And everybody was happy with it, correct?
It seemed that way.
Yeah.
Seems that way, yeah.
I'd move favorable.
Okay, is there a second?
Second.
All right, any other questions about this bill?
And there was no opposition?
No opposition.
Okay.
Kristen, was that the case?
That's the case, no opposition.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
All right.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, bill passes. Thank you. Okay, let's move on to Senate Bill 737, Comprehensive Conservation Finance Act. And, I had hoped to give the advocate, say, around 40 minutes to present because it is a lengthy bill. The subcommittee members have to leave at 1:30, no problem. But, my guess is we'll continue a little bit after then. So with that, I want to turn things over to John Griffin and Tim Mao. I'm sorry.
Mail.
Mail. Okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the
Afternoon.
committee. Nice to see some of you whom I've worked with in the past. And thank you very much for this opportunity. I think your staff Tim is on as well, but we're going to put up some slides.
Put it up now.
Yeah, please.
All right.
If that's okay. Yeah.
Of course.
We just thought that might be the easiest way to kind of highlight what's in this bill and what the intentions were behind it.
Okay, is it up?
Yes, you can go to the second slide, if you don't mind. I just wanted to spend a quick moment here, in case you were wondering where this bill came from. 3 nonprofits, the Chesapeake Conservation Partnership, which I staff, the Land Trust Alliance, and the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, were all interested in this subject. And so we co-sponsored a roundtable in late April of 2019 with a very diversified group of government, nonprofit, and private investors and restoration companies. Following that, we formed work groups and spent on and off the rest of our time through earlier this year perfecting this bill and having it introduced. So I might mention as part of that, we spent a lot of time with Maryland state agencies, getting their input, making changes, et cetera. So this has been the product of a lot of work by a very diverse group of companies and nonprofits and state agencies on and off for a while. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn this over to Tim, if I might, at this point. We'll go back and forth.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Mr. Chair and delegates for listening to us speak about this bill. So it probably seems to a lot of you that every time there's money spent on conservation or the environment, it's always public money. It's always you all that are spending it. But there's this sort of global trend toward private finance playing a bigger and bigger role in conservation. That amount is estimated to be something like $200 billion a year in just the next few years. So to give a couple of examples, one kind of private finance that plays a big role in conservation in the United States today is around wetland banking and stream banking, where someone in one place is impacting a stream, a developer or a road project, and private companies or sometimes private nonprofits in advance have restored a stream or wetland, much like Maryland's forest banks have protected those streams or wetlands. And the two private parties make an exchange in order to pay for that protection activity. So that market nationally is something like $5 billion a year of transactions that are going on. Of course, and I know you all have spoken a lot about carbon and climate change in this session. The projected global demand for carbon offset credits is something like $30 to $50 billion a year in just the next few years. Those could include things like forest protection and restoration, a lot of agricultural practices that can sequester or store carbon, and then blue carbon or projects in the ocean or aquatic habitats are another category. And what, as John spoke about the process that we went through with this legislation, what we were thinking about in the beginning of that process is what are the kinds of changes that we could make in Maryland policy that wouldn't add any state cost, any new public cost, but would lead to something like $100 million a year of additional private investment in Maryland, after about 5 years, after an implementation period. So that's some of the context that we were thinking about, and other advocates, the folks that John mentioned, were thinking about in putting together this bill. Next slide, please. And so some of the reasons why public policy, state, federal, local policy is so crucial to this investment is first that it's, as I mentioned before, it's new, it's relatively new. So a lot of programs that were built on the concept of public money or taxpayer-driven programs, there's just some sort of growing pains in terms of fitting these new approaches in. One example is just being able to do much larger restoration projects, much larger green infrastructure projects. Pension funds have started to invest in natural assets, in things like green infrastructure. For some of those pension funds, they won't even consider an investment unless it's more than 50 or more than $100 million. So just being able to scale up the size of the work that all the parties who are involved in this kind of activity are ready to do is a key part of what policy can provide for. Another is that, and you all know this better than I do, but the risk of uncertainty from government action or policy can discourage investment. And so if there's ways, just often through clear signaling in policy, to make it clear that the public sector values private investment in conservation, it can play a big role in encouraging more of that private investment. A third area is that restoration permits, restoration projects can often be more difficult to pursue than a development project, than a road development. It can take longer or just be more complicated to get projects like that reviewed. And so, for example, in this legislation, there's a couple of task forces or commissions, but one of them is focused on bringing together state experts, nonprofit and business experts to figure out, are there good ideas on how we can make restoration quicker and easier to pursue restoration, things like stream restoration, tree planting, wetland restoration, green infrastructure. And then there's sort of these, and this gets sort of back at the first point as well, there's opportunities to do much bigger projects where you're pulling together money from maybe multiple public sources, but also private sources. So one of the biggest new sources of private investment into conservation is from philanthropies. So there are charities that have like endowments, like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation is one of the ones that I work with on the public health side. And they're interested in putting some of their capital into projects that would make a low rate of return, but also produce the kind of goods, environmental justice benefits, climate benefits, et cetera. And so trying to figure out how to bring public programs together with private investment like that is another sort of area of opportunity. Next slide, please. So in this, the process of developing this bill, these are examples of the organizations that have submitted testimony or letters of support for the legislation. As John mentioned, this includes investment organizations like Hannon Armstrong Hannon Armstrong is the first exclusively climate-focused, publicly traded investment company on the stock exchange. Organizations like mine, the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, Chesapeake Conservancy, Chesapeake Bay Foundation, the Grain Producers, the Forest Association of Maryland. So a diversity of partners. The bill in the Senate side had no opposition. We made a number of amendments, in particular to address state agency concerns, had support from multiple state agencies, passed both the committee in the Senate and then the full Senate unanimously. So that's a little background on the bill. The fiscal note, which I know you have in front of you, found there were no new state costs associated with passage of this legislation, that it would likely contribute to local business or revenue, and also likely contribute to local government revenue. Next slide, please. And so on the next few slides, I'm just going to do some highlights to talk about some of the details of what's in the bill. This is more of a programmatic across the board look, and then I'll just jump into 4 areas of detail, and then that's it for our presentation. So just sort of overall, the bill, as I mentioned, was looking at how do we increase private capital investment in Maryland at conservation, use that to supplement all the state goals that you all know so well around the Chesapeake Bay and climate. In particular, we were trying to think about how do you expand investment in green and blue infrastructure. Green infrastructure being, rain gardens and all sorts of activities on land. Blue infrastructure just being the same thing, but in aquatic or marine habitats. Another idea was how do we promote partnerships? So to me, the Prince George's County Clean Water Partnership is one of the biggest and the most exciting. It's the biggest environmental public-private partnership in the country. Really excited about that as a national advocate for a whole bunch of environmental work. But there's a lot of opportunity to bring together foundations, restoration businesses, nonprofits with state agencies to support conservation, to make sure we can achieve climate progress, focused on forest conservation and restoration. The bill brings in a number of priorities around environmental justice, and I'll mention these in more detail a little bit later. And the last point I'd make, I guess this isn't a basic of the bill, but it takes a lot of pages to do those things. But what we've found, at least in terms of the testimony, submitted letters of support, is that the details take a lot of pages, but it's not necessarily very complicated. And basically what we're doing is creating authorizations for state agencies to use various programs in certain ways to advance conservation and restoration. Next slide, please. Thank you. So on the green and blue infrastructure side, the bill would create the first ever state law definition of what is blue infrastructure. So that's again focused on marine and aquatic habitat, things like eelgrass or oyster reef restoration, and how that can count as infrastructure. It would also expand the definition of green infrastructure to include climate resilience. Both of those would also include carbon sequestration benefits. Just as background, the standard definition of green infrastructure now is one that comes from federal laws and is really exclusively focused on water quality. The bill would, much like California has done, recognize that natural infrastructure throughout watersheds, things like the practices that farmers can do on their land, that those things count as infrastructure in just the same way that gray infrastructure, things like wastewater treatment plants, count. It would authorize the state revolving funds to be used for watershed and forest preservation, including urban tree canopy goals. That's consistent with the way that those state revolving loan funds that MDE manages and that every other state has are used in other states like Vermont or Iowa, Washington State. It sets up an advisory committee on blue and green infrastructure. I mentioned this in my opening notes. That could look at how can you accelerate deployment of restoration projects and blue and green infrastructure projects. It also establishes a task force on local government accounting standards. So as a former city council member, I know we knew the value of our buildings, our library, our police cars, but we didn't know the value of our trees, our streams, our stormwater features. And so there's a growing movement across the country to figure out how to quantify the value of those kinds of assets and bring them into balance sheets, this would establish a task force led by the University of Maryland to do that. And the last thing I'll mention here on green and blue infrastructure is loan guarantees. So loan guarantees are currently authorized under the state revolving loan funds. A loan guarantee is basically the state backstopping a loan. So if somebody's going to a private lender to get a loan, knowing that the state is sort of behind the project, can lower the interest rate. Right now, it's only water utilities or local government that can tap into these loan guarantees, and they haven't particularly used them in Maryland. This legislation would allow, and this provision has EPA's approval, would allow nonprofits or for-profits to also tap into those loan guarantees. Next slide, please. So on carbon and climate resilience, the bill makes a number of very small changes, and none of them have, as I mentioned before, any budget cost associated with them. The first is just to ensure that if you have, let's say, a farmer or a private forest landowner who's got a contract with Department of Agriculture or DNR, that existing state contract doesn't prevent them from selling credits, let's say, to a voluntary carbon market, to an airline, for example. And so there's language that says that existing state contract can't prohibit them from doing that or shouldn't prohibit them from doing that. We made a few amendments to address agency feedback on this, as long as doing so produces some additional conservation benefits. A second provision would authorize, it doesn't provide a lot of detail on exactly what this would include, but authorizes DNR to develop a working group to figure out how to build carbon aggregation policies, especially for small properties. So carbon aggregation is easy if you're in Mississippi, where you've got a 10,000 acre forest and a single landowner can figure out how to quantify all that carbon in one place. But when you have lots of small properties, the transaction cost of just the paperwork really is really difficult. So this is partly meant to get around that issue of sort of small properties sizes in the Mid-Atlantic just region in general. It encourages Department of Agriculture to collaborate. It's a similar provision with Department of Agriculture to collaborate with knowledgeable organizations in the carbon market to help Department of Ag develop frameworks and tools that would help landowners aggregate and sell carbon credits. This is a different provision, allows restoration on state forests, on state lands. So replanting forests on state lands to potentially count to meet the buffer or the insurance requirements of various carbon protocols, mostly voluntary carbon protocols that exist around the world. So as opposed to a single private landowner trying to figure out how to meet those buffer requirements on their 50 acre or 100 acre forested property, it potentially allows the state forests, restored state forests, to do that same purpose. The goal behind this was to help encourage and incentivize more restoration of forests on current state lands that don't have forests on them. And the last piece I'll mention here is that it brings climate resilience and carbon sequestration benefits, as well as those things like oyster reef restoration benefits, in as a co-benefit when DNR considers the water quality grant applications that they would fund under the Bay Trust Fund. So it mentions co-benefits in a number of ways. I'll mention some more co-benefits on the environmental justice side in a few minutes. But the key thing is it just gives some stronger priorities for DNR in terms of things that the state would want to get in addition to water quality benefits.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Doug, you want to ask your question now?
Yes, please. If you wouldn't mind, if I could ask a couple questions on this slide before we go on. I'm sorry to interrupt. It's just this is an awful lot of information, and it's just be good if I could ask questions.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. So when you're talking about allowing landowners to sell in voluntary markets, where they have easements, contracts, and agreements, wouldn't this potentially allow for, say, like double dipping, where they're getting income from a carbon market, but they also,
Force mitigation.
So, where they're getting multiple benefits for the same property?
If I could respond to that, Doug, the key part of the language is that it requires there be additional conservation benefits. So you would have it's language that's very similar to federal language in the federal farm bill that uses that same kind of construct. There has to be additional conservation that's documented. But if there is additional, then you could pay for that additional benefit with the carbon credit. And so it should very much address that issue of double dipping or getting paid for something twice. It also should lead to more documentation of those kinds of benefits, so you have just better numbers overall.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of the allowing public lands to count for the private lands carbon protocol requirements, is that meaning that they would be then paying to do work on public lands? How does that work?
So when we were discussing this in those working groups that John mentioned, the way it was envisioned is that for currently unforested state lands, the state might pursue restoration of those lands at any point after 2021, which is when this provision would kick in. So that landowners enrolling in the voluntary carbon markets could still choose to satisfy buffer requirements on their own properties. It's typically something like you have to set aside 10% of your trees that you can't sell while selling 90% credits for 90%. So if there were restored forests on state lands, then in theory, if the department chose to implement this provision, they could give for a fee, the landowner ability to buy basically buy a chunk of that state forest as a reserve, or the state could set it up so that it creates revenue to pay for future forest restoration. The bill doesn't provide any detail on which of those would be, more likely or clarify that in any other way. And the main purpose of it was, again, just because Maryland properties are so small, maybe there's a way to create a bigger, basically conservation buffer that we all know of, that's easier to track, easier to keep track of, and make sure it doesn't get impacted in the future, as opposed to doing lots of little buffers on lots of properties across the state.
Sure, that makes sense. But I guess, my question is this work that the state wouldn't do without the fee from the private landowner? Or is it work that would be done anyway, and then we're allowing the private landowner to just sort of piggyback on that?
I think it came up because we heard about the need to do more reforestation, but that there was a lack of any funding to pay for it. So my guess is that it wouldn't have otherwise happened but for this provision.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Delegate Stein, Mr. Chair. I just
Yes.
wanted to add to, if I could, to Tim's comments in terms of Delegate Roost's questions, which were very good. We don't have carbon offset markets in Maryland, as the first bullet mentions. States around us, Pennsylvania, Virginia, have active carbon offset markets. So we want to catch up both for meeting Bay goals and to assist in meeting climate goals. And the other question you asked on using restored state forest land after 2021 is amending a portion of the forestry statute in DNR that lists incentives to private forest landowners, who, as you may know, the majority of forest land here and elsewhere is owned by smaller owners, multiple parcels. So anyway, I just thought I'd add that in. That's helpful.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
I do have a follow-up question to one of Delegate Roost's questions about the ability to tap into the voluntary carbon markets to achieve additional conservation benefits. So would it be the responsibility of, say, depending on which is the relevant department, say Department of Agriculture or DNR, to verify that if a private landowner or a farmer that's already gotten state assistance for, say, all the improvements, say cover crops or whatever, that they are making additional conservation benefits in proportion to the additional funding they're getting through the carbon markets? Is that the state agency's responsibility, I guess, is my question.
That's a great question, Delegate Stein. The way we were thinking about it, again, this is in advance of particular markets being real yet in Maryland, but partly thinking about that USDA, the federal policy. It's basically meant to be a statement in advance of a lot of transactions to create certainty for the market. So I guess the way I'd expect it would work out is you might have landowners who start expressing interest to MDA on joining into carbon markets. this statement would be a statement of policies that MDA knows in advance. Okay, just because we have cost share agreements with these landowners, shouldn't mean that they can't do this. How would we determine whether, if they're asking our permission at all, that it's okay for them to participate in these markets? Well, as long as there's, additional activity beyond what we've paid for. So I think it's sort of people often talk about carbon space being sort of a Wild West. There's no policy at all right now in this question. And so it would create a signal that says, it's okay to do this as long as there's an additional benefit. So I think from a practical perspective, the way I'd imagine it working out is a landowner asks the state, can I do this under my contract or my easement with you? And you'd say, so what else are you doing that produces the benefits that you'd be being paid for by Southwest Airlines or whoever it was? And they describe that. They describe the activities that they're pursuing. And so I think that's the way it would work in practice. But I think even if it doesn't involve a explicit request for permission, it would create clarity for those landowners or nonprofits or anybody else that, okay, this is the way it's supposed to work. As long as I'm doing some additional things, I should be able to get credit for those. So even without policy, just from a sort of a plain reading of the language, it gives you a signal as a landowner of what you need to do to be able to participate in those markets, which I think would be helpful and then that's the kind of feedback we heard from these groups, that it would be just helpful to have that guidance from the state.
Chair, could I follow up?
Okay, sure.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry. It's just that, more questions came up as he was talking. So it sounds like the bill doesn't establish policies for how that's actually going to work. And so I was just wondering if any of the departments are on, if they could talk about whether they have put any work into developing the policies for how this would work or how it would be determined.
Tyler or James?
Did James show up or Ed?
He's on there. I don't know if he's.
Yeah.
I can, do you want me to, is Tyler not still on?
Tyler's here.
That's me talking.
Hey guys, sorry about that. Had a little trouble with the mute button. Delegate, do you mind repeating your question? I apologize.
Yes, no, sorry about that. So we were talking about like this first bullet point here where there are state easements, contracts or agreements, but then there's possibly an additional environmental benefit that, that they could achieve by selling in carbon markets. And trying to identify how this would actually work. And the Chair Stein asked like who would determine, whether there's sufficient benefit to allow this. And there was, it sounded like there was some uncertainty in Mr. Mail. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong.
Tim Mail.
Mail's answer. And I just wondered if the departments have put any work into, if you've put any work into developing regulations, how you would determine if somebody wants to sell in a carbon market, whether that there is sufficient additional benefit.
Yeah, so this is, really, speaks to the, the ambition of this legislation. I mean, this is entirely new programming for the department. So, I can't offer any certainty in terms of, we've, been, actively drafting regs or anything to that effect. But, I think in short, no, we don't have, anything set up similar to this yet, but the bill will allow us to get the ball rolling.
Sure, I understand. And obviously, as has been said, we don't have a carbon market, but thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Tim, you want to continue with your review?
Sure, thank you. And just 2 more slides. So the next slide, here we go, thank you, is focused on various procurement provisions in the bill. Procurement being just simply, as you know, how to contract for work. And in this case, focused on the environment agencies and Department of Agriculture. So the bill would do 2 things in the procurement code. It would add a definition of a term called environmental outcome to the code. And that would just mean it's an environmental outcome is a commodity that's either modeled or directly measured. And it's a certified unit of environmental improvement, including something like a carbon benefit or a nutrient benefit, a nitrogen and phosphorus benefit. It would allow the state to transact based on, that definition of a commodity, just like a ream of paper is a commodity, or a laptop or a new truck is a commodity. So it makes it clear that the state can, sign contracts based on buying those outcomes. Maryland and the Chesapeake Bay in general are a rare part of the country because you all have the Chesapeake Bay model and a whole bunch of quantification tools that help you define what hundreds of things are in terms of their water quality benefits, how much nitrogen or phosphorus, pollution reduction they'll produce. That's really rare across the country, but every other part of the country is trying to catch up with different quantification schemes, especially on agricultural lands, but also across the board in water quality. So this provision really helps you take advantage of sort of already established science and practice in the state. And then on the carbon side, we've already talked about that a bit, but it would also let you purchase things like carbon outcomes if you were trying to offset state activities, or local government were trying to buy carbon outcomes for some reason. The second piece is a contracting provision, which would add, it doesn't require any agency to use, but it adds something called a pay for success contract to the list of contracting options that state agencies have available to them. And a pay for success contract option, and you may have heard about this during the discussions about the Clean Water Commerce Act, so it's extremely similar to what was in that bill, or what is in that bill. It's basically just a provision that allows contracting, a party responding to a solicitation, an RFP for a state contract, to say, well, we're going to provide these kinds of outcomes, let's say nitrogen pollution reduction outcomes, and this is the way we quantify them. This is the way we propose the state would confirm that we had produced those outcomes, and we would get paid after there's some verified delivery of those outcomes, and this is the timeline in which a party would be paid. So pay for success, and I didn't give my background at the beginning of this call, apologies, but I worked at the Obama administration's Council on Environmental Quality at the White House, and pay for success was an extremely sort of popular and rising form of contracting being used in social programs, like in education and in health outcomes, and continues to be so, with particular leadership by states. Bipartisan list of governors have been using pay for success, but it's so far rare in the environmental space. It's not been used very often. Louisiana is really the one exception that's put pay for success into any state law. But this bill, as well as the Clean Water Commerce Act, brings pay for success in as a contracting authority. I think it's particularly helpful in Maryland, and because Maryland has already, through sort of experimental ways, made a lot of progress on this. Like Anne Arundel County for their stormwater program is using something very much like a pay for success contracting approach, where they're basically asking people, well, we'll pay you when you deliver completed projects. What's the lowest price you'll give us for completed stream restoration project? So Maryland's already a really exciting place when it comes to this form of contracting. This bill would just bring that officially into the procurement code.
I have a question on that, Mr. Chair, if I could.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand this pay for success thing. And good to see you. I actually know Tim as a council member because he was a city council member in Tacoma Park, but I almost called you council member. I guess I still can. So I was a very low on the totem pole, but it was actually a White House intern in 2013. And I remember when, then I think it was more called like social impact bonds. And I know that's like a bit of a misnomer. So that's why I think it's now called like pay for success contracting. But I remember when this was sort of all the rage, and I remember like the prison recidivism studies and all that, stuff. And I hadn't actually realized that it had gone now, or had started been flowing into the environmental arena. But I guess my question here is how this would work is, just so I understand, is that private investors would sort of pay a service provider to do some sort of restoration project. The state would only pay if it hits some sort of benchmark, some sort of quantifiable benchmark. And there would be like an evaluator, like some sort of neutral third party to determine that.
Yeah, right? That's correct, Delegate Stewart. Good
and then a nonprofit would sort of like oversee all this and sort of put all the parties together. Is that right?
So in the social programs, that kind of nonprofit intermediary was a big part of the original design. Those programs get really complicated, though. That's been one of the findings on the social side, is that they've just tended to build these sort of really complicated structures with lots of different parties. So I think the key roles are the buyer, right? In this case, the state, the provider, the private company, and nonprofit, even a local government could compete for these kinds of contracts, and then the verifier. So those are the three roles that are envisioned. Now, like in the, you could have intermediaries who bundle lots of projects together, and that's sort of what I think about the Clean Water Partnership in Prince George's being like, where you've got 100 individual projects on individual properties delivering cleaner water, but somebody is sort of managing all the train schedules in between. So you could still have an intermediary role like that under the contracts.
So ultimately, the state, I mean, taxpayers would essentially be on the hook to pay for any intermediaries involved in the contracting process, including the evaluator, because I mean, that would be baked into the overall cost of the project. And so obviously, essentially, taxpayers would be paying private entities for taking on the risk that the project fails.
Yes, that's correct. There's a provision in the language that we put together that requires that the relevant procurement officer make a determination that this contracting approach would save the state money. So with those costs included, the whole package would still have to be less expensive than other contracting approaches. And the work, and I'm by no means a comprehensive expert on the social programs across the country, but I've done a little bit of work on that. And in general, there's been cost savings that have been found. In the Maryland examples, so like the one DOT contract that exists, the Anne Arundel County contract, as well as the Louisiana contract I mentioned, one project in California, the government folks involved have generally reported significant cost savings. So like Anne Arundel County reports 25% cost savings associated with full delivery. DOT has talked, and they were part of these working groups that we mentioned. DOT told us that they had saved 75% versus their previous way of doing stormwater projects. So even with those sort of evaluation roles and potential intermediary roles, they're still finding that there's huge cost savings.
Okay, yeah, and any studies that you can send on the cost saving front would be really helpful for me as we consider this bill. I think I found an independent evaluation by RAND Europe back in the day on one of these first social impact bond financing programs in the UK. And it seems like the UK has in general been ahead of the US on this, but it basically, found that it was a prison reentry program. Basically found that it was sort of too small of a pilot to deliver any real savings. And that's the only one, that was the only study I found. But to the extent that y'all can find any studies, I want to make sure, I mean, to me, it seems like, if the state can already be doing this, then why pay all the middlemen and to basically just that? To me, that strikes me as kind of an admission that the state isn't doing its job. It seems like if the state was delivering measurable outcomes and doing the right thing, then that would be cheaper just for the state to do the state's job rather than paying a litany of middlemen and then ensuring that private investors get a profit at the end of the day. So I worry about bloated cost savings. I worry about maybe also confusion or disagreements over whether benchmarks were hit, right? I can imagine a link, I think in other contexts, at least that I've just seen by Googling it, there are sometimes disagreements about whether this benchmark was hit there. And of course, then you're into a court battle. So anything you can send, I'm sort of rambling at this point, but I mean, I guess my question is just reiterating that anything you can send about the cost savings or about how this has worked elsewhere. I assume there are no studies about pay to success programs in the environmental arena, right? Because we're kind of like one of the first movers here. So
yeah, thank you.
Anything on the other arenas would be helpful.
Happy to send the background that we can put together.
Okay.
Just on the intermediary piece, just one last comment on this, and then I'll do the last slide and then welcome any other questions and discussion. Again, compared to the social impact side, where there were a lot of intermediaries built into contracts, this legislation really does not do that. As I said, it creates a role for verification, but the state could also provide the verification service. Right. And verification is basically, running that model, running the Bay model on the projects, and somebody confirming that indeed someone actually did put this thing on the, planted the trees or did the stream restoration. So it's pretty simple confirmation. when I talk about this with people in the social impact side, they always say, well, it's so much easier in the environment. You guys know exactly what the outcomes are. And of course, it doesn't feel like that when you're working on environmental conservation programs. But there's a lot more simplicity here. So, and I will provide information on the cost savings that I'm aware of, but they've generally been significant, at least in the anecdotal information I've seen.
Delegate Stein, my supplement what Tim just said to Delegate Stewart, just quickly.
Sure, and then we have a question from Delegate Boyce.
Great. I would just add to, when I was at the Department of Natural Resources, we were trying to introduce into the annual grants that are competitively awarded under the Chesapeake Bay Trust Fund, sort of a pay for success delivery. And to piggyback on what Tim just said, the reason we wanted to do that was, as opposed to paying for projects, we wanted to buy outcomes. And so certain grants were awarded to certain companies working with nonprofits and they would negotiate up front the actual metrics to measure success. And the companies would have to put at risk their capital, et cetera, et cetera. And if those outcomes were determined to have been met based on those metrics, then they would get reimbursed a certain amount following construction. And then there's a post-construction, it varies, but let's say 5-year monitoring and repair period where the company has to fix anything that goes wrong. And then there's a wasting fund set up that goes to a third party, like a land trust, to oversee long-term maintenance and repairs. So I don't really, so all I'm trying to say is, where we're familiar with this, whether it's Anne Arundel or Department of Natural Resources, there's not really any intermediaries. The agencies, at least in my experience, have the staff to go out and verify whether outcomes have been met. Anyway.
Okay, thank you.
If that's helpful.
Sure. Delegate Boyce?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. This feels like Coptic. Like I got to page 30 of this bill and just walked away. So I say that to say, one, will this slide be available for viewing to kind of use it to go through the bill? And then two, we've had a number of bills. I've heard us mention the Water Commerce Act and some other bills, and I'm wondering how, if it's helpful, I think it'd be helpful for me and my colleagues, how this all fits in with those other ones. So a lot of markup I had in the bill were exactly some of the questions that Delegate Ruth had about a lot of mitigation and a lot of, it would seem to a degree, depending on, how you can label the project, double dipping. And so I'm just trying to get a hold of this because I definitely want to be kind of on the forefront, for Maryland to be on the forefront, because I do think we are behind, especially if other folks are doing this and they're doing it well. But I think we need a better grasp of this. Just to get a better understanding of this, because it feels a lot, although when you actually go through it, it's not like every page is marked up, but just how this fits in a grander scheme of a lot of the other bills, like the Climate Solutions Now Act and all these other bills that have come before this. Again, how are they kind of marrying one another and complementing one another? That's a lot, I know, but this is rough.
Well, I can start, but then I'll turn it to John as well. Yes, excuse me, the slides are available, and any other background we're happy to provide as well. There's a handful of fact sheets and deeper dives on pieces of the bill.
Thank you.
Associated with the Commerce Act, the Clean Water Commerce Act provisions, very similar language, really no conflict. But just because the bills diverged a little bit in the process of development, there's some word changes here and there. I really don't view them as in conflict. But during the Senate amendment process, an amendment was added by the Senate that says that these pay for success provisions do not apply to the Clean Water Commerce Act program. So it eliminates any conflict there. Again, there are very small differences in sort of process and wording that I'd read. John, anything else to add?
Well, just that.
I'm sorry, I guess more the question is really how does it complement, if anything, versus conflict?
Sure. Well, can I take that and respond to it in terms of your climate legislation? I think it's a great complement to that, and it really expands the universe of policies and programs that help achieve your climate reduction goals. If you think about it, I mean, this was focused on natural assets, this whole bill really. Everybody talks about letting nature be more of a solution to pollution and other environmental goals. Well, this bill was designed to really accentuate all that using natural assets. So we can elaborate on that, but it's really a nice, very nice complement to your climate legislation. And on the Clean Water Commerce Act, there are ways that financing done under that could be combined with some of the other authorized uses of funds like the Bay Trust Fund, state revolving loan funds under this particular legislation. But if you want us to elaborate on that, we can. I don't know if that helped, but
I think the thing that I think I can start from is essentially, I think you hit the nail on the head, which I think helps bring it into some more perspective, is that instead of trying to create assets and create solutions, we're using what we already have to create those solutions, and we're using, a kind of a public-private partnership to do so. So meeting our goals by leveraging assets to enhance what we already have to mitigate a lot of our problems.
yes, well put. Thank you.
Thank you.
Delegate Otto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Delegate Boyce, you did sum that up quite well earlier. Mr. Secretary, good to see you here
Good
again.
to see you, Delegate Otto.
Your outreach about this bill, and I was ready to just vote favorable for it until we've had this presentation. Now I got some concerns.
Well, that's the purpose of these sessions, I assume.
But I know your intentions are good, and certainly to utilize private assets to
Private capital,
establish these programs will be, and give them a criteria for credibility will be great.
Thank you.
You were aware there was a carbon trading program in the Department of Ag. They got a grant from USDA. Lord, it might have been 8 or 10 years ago, and they had it for a couple of years, establishing some parameters and this, that, and the other. Nothing was ever traded, I don't believe, but they did a lot of work in who the stakeholders were and how to do things. So.
Yes, well, if I could comment on that, in our discussions with MDA, the USDA has a carbon model developed by University of Colorado. And with some modifications, USDA uses that as a way to ascertain whether on farmland carbon sequestration activities generate sequestration. And the MDA folks told us that they were doing their own version of that, which is part of what I think you're referring to.
Yes.
It's just a state-based model protocol to verify carbon sequestration measures on state farmland. At the time that we were speaking with them, it's been several months, I don't know if they finished that or not, but that's what that was all about. So this doesn't conflict with that. It would only be a measure that would help move this along, actually.
Thanks for being here with us today.
Sure, not at all. My pleasure.
Delegate Stewart.
I'm good, actually. I'm good for now. Thank you. I'll go ahead and let him finish his presentation.
Okay. Great. Tim, why don't you finish your presentation, and I'd like to wrap up in the interest of everyone's time by 2. So let's see.
Sure.
Hopefully we can do that.
Sure.
Great. Thank you. So just the last slide, please. The last slide describes the environmental justice benefits of the bill, or at least the sort of major ones that stand out. The first provision would ask the existing state Environmental Justice Commission to identify steps it would take to help Maryland establish a human right to water. So that's something that's in law in California. It's been passed by resolution in Virginia. I think it's a ballot process that's being moved forward by the legislature in New York. But essentially, guaranteeing a right to access to affordable, clean, safe water, drinking water, and wastewater services. The second is state revolving loan funds. And I mentioned this idea of, co-benefits issues before, but for the SRFs, it would bring in toxic lead water pipe replacement as a priority for the SRFs. Consolidation, if there are, more than 100 water utilities in Maryland, but where those utilities struggle to provide safe drinking water and they want to do consolidation, they want to merge with or merge services with another utility, it would allow the SRF to be used for that purpose. And then it brings in a priority around green infrastructure that eliminate or reduces hazards for burdened communities, as well as technical assistance, a grant instead of a loan, a small amount of SRF funding to be used basically to help communities that need it be able to plan big infrastructure projects. Now, this bill was put together, 6 months ago-ish. All of these provisions are actually mirrored really, really nicely in the infrastructure package that just came out from the Biden-Harris administration. So the Biden-Harris administration's proposed $45 billion in the SRF program for lead pipe replacement, as an example. This idea of technical assistance grants for struggling communities is a key limitation on the SRF program nationally, where only a small fraction of communities, utilities apply for state revolving loan funds because the application process is super complicated and your project has to be really far along before you apply. So each of these provisions are ones that are based on sort of national examples of either stuff that's happening like consolidation. This money is used to support, it's not a mandatory thing, it's support any utility or community that wants help with consolidation. These are things that are used in many other states across the country. And then the last piece I'll mention is just the Chesapeake and Coastal Bays Trust Fund would be amended to, in the selection process that DNR uses to pick projects, would add in local jobs benefits and environmental justice co-benefits in as criteria that might help make decisions. And just one reminder on that, I mentioned before, also bringing in blue infrastructure benefits, carbon benefits to that same trust fund, but the list of things that were added as priorities during the selection process also include local jobs and environmental justice. So I'll stop there. Thank you, and welcome any more questions or discussion.
Okay, Delegate Boyce.
Let you know I had a question. Tyler, is Tyler still here?
Still here.
Let's see.
Hi,
Yeah.
Tyler. Quick question. Actually, well, let me start with Tim. Tim, when you asked about the Environmental Justice Commission identifying steps, would this be steps to create a constitutional amendment? Are you talking more about, or just something in legislation?
We didn't, the bill doesn't ask for any specificity on where it would be established, just the Justice Commission's recommendations for how to do it. It could be that that would be what they'd recommend, but no one had any preconceived notion of what that might look like. But just there's a lot of implementation steps to figure out in terms of how to make it a real right. And so that was the intent of what we were looking at.
Did anyone talk to the commission?
Is John still here? John, you're on mute.
You might want to direct that to Tyler. We did not talk to the commission directly.
I figured as much. I just wanted to ask Tyler about
Sure.
if this already exists within MDE's either policy or codes. Just curious.
I don't know if the specific language is within policy or codes. But Devin did look at this language and did not raise concerns.
Good,
just so
good.
you know.
I'm just wondering, it just seems like it would be something already, not necessarily with MDE, but maybe like something with, like for instance, in the city, maybe it's one of their tenets or one of their policies or promises. But when I saw this, I think in this, because I had notes written in my documents here, just the question of because I know we tried to do a I forget, Delegate Lafferty did it, I think our first year, about a constitutional amendment regarding the right to.
Clean air and pure water. Yeah, I had that bill
Yeah.
last session. Wynika Fisher has it this session.
Right. So I'm just wondering if it already existed, but no, those are just my questions.
Thank
I
you.
don't see any issue with it. I think the question, I just wanted to know if it already existed.
I
Okay.
I don't believe it does, Delegate Boyce.
Okay. All right.
So,
Thank you.
and last two questions from Delegate Stewart and Delegate Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all again for joining us. This has been, this is obviously a super, super complicated bill. And so I'm trying to wrap my head around kind of each point at each stage, and I'm struggling, but I'm trying. And I'll do more reading before we meet next. But so yeah, first on the human right issue, I mean, I think that's nice, but it seems like the only step we really need to take is to pass the bill that has been introduced before the General Assembly for the last 3 sessions. I don't think we really need I don't even think we necessarily need the Environmental Justice Commission to tell us to do that. We already know what to do. And in fact, you reference this New York legislation, that New York legislation moving, the legislation moving forward in New York, which is mentioned parenthetically here, is just the exact bill that we have already before us. So, certainly I certainly hope that bill passes, but I don't necessarily think we need the Environmental Justice Commission. I would appreciate their imprimatur, but I don't think we necessarily need them to do anything. Just going back to the pay for success contracting piece, I just wanted to follow up on something that Tim mentioned earlier. At what stage in the process would someone from the agency have to sort of give the green light to say this is going to be cheaper than doing it in a more conventional financing way?
Before initiating the contracting process overall. So before putting out the RFP, using a pay for success approach in the RFP, they would have had to have made that determination.
Okay, so it's a little bit of an estimate at that point, right? Because we don't know how much it would ultimately end up costing. So they have to just kind of say, based on the project estimate, based on our estimate for how much it would cost under a traditional public financing arrangement, we think that the private financing would be cheaper. But if it proved to be more expensive, nothing would happen, right? We would just be on the hook for it.
Right.
Right.
Well, go ahead, Tim.
So if the cost ran up after the fact, in other words, if the person from the agency sort of was mistaken, or if the projections came in a little bit lower than reality, we'd be on the hook. And is it an all or nothing? Is it an all or nothing payout in terms of meeting the benchmark? It's like a 1 or a 0, right? Like like you either meet it and there's a full payout, or you don't and then there's no payout, or is there any sort of partial payout?
No, you'd base the payment on for example, nitrogen or phosphorus. If you were supposed to deliver 10,000 pounds of nitrogen and you delivered 9,000 pounds of nitrogen pollution removal, you'd pay for the 9,000. And it's rare that a contract only includes one performance measure. There's certainly like construction and implementation measures, but you'd pay proportional to that.
Okay.
Can I add to that,
Sure.
Delegate Bond, Mr. Chair? But if cost per unit of reduction, the credits they get for a pound of nitrogen, pound of phosphorus, for example, they negotiate that in a contract with the agency. And if those costs are higher than the amounts in the contract, as you were alluding to, then they're only going to get paid for what they negotiated for, which is the beauty of that. There's no such thing as cost overruns on pay for success contracts. So from my understanding of this and working with companies who like to do this, is they put their capital at risk. They have to get the permits, et cetera, et cetera. They have to go ahead and build it, whatever it is, like a stream restoration project. And as I was mentioning earlier, at least what DNR has done in their trust fund grants for these kind of grant awards is they, upon verification that the construction is done in accordance with the bid specs, et cetera, then they award them 75% payment, but they withhold the other 25 for 5 years because they want to see the continuing results of the monitoring.
And John, just add one other detail. I just reviewed, for example, an advance notice of a contract for Montgomery County. This isn't a pay for success contract, but it's used across the board in contracting. Montgomery County said we expect the cost to not exceed this amount for these contracts. So you'd have that same kind of cap, which if you had a past, rate of paying for things that you expected from any contract type, you'd put that in, or you'd say, well, it needs to be 10% less than that. You would have a cost cap in there, and local and state government routinely cancel RFPs if the bids they get are more expensive than they expected.
That makes sense. And I know we're running up on the time. I just throw one other kind of argument that may come up in our deliberations, and I think it's one that you sort of oftentimes see in the literature or whatever, that, well, if you do pay for success contracting, you essentially turn the service provider into someone who's doing something for the public good or purely for environmental reasons, to someone who is primarily doing something for a profit motive. And that when you make that paradigm shift, that at times you can have corners cutting. So I mean, I think the paradigm, the exemplar, examples, right, that people would point out would be something like teaching to the test in an educational context. Maybe you had to cut back on recess hours. You had to cut back on art courses or whatever in order to hit that benchmark. And it all becomes about the benchmark, because that's the only way investors can be paid. Or another example of the social impact bond scheme that I found from the UK was about homelessness and trying to get folks off the street, and they had to reach a certain percentage threshold of homelessness. And I believe I read that one of the ways they got there is by deporting a lot of the homeless people who are not in the country with documentation. So could y'all just respond to this idea that whenever you implement sort of a profit motive, even if the benchmark is being hit, you could be introducing these sort of problematic corner cutting mechanisms that maybe have outcomes that you wouldn't know otherwise, that would produce outcomes that you wouldn't normally see in kind of a typical public model.
So welcome following up in more detail after this meeting on this, but my simple answer is that most of the contracting that already occurs in Maryland for any project of any size are already done by for-profit companies. So, stream restorations, sidewalk projects, you name it, they're done by for-profit companies. So they already have that incentive. And the question is, does this contracting approach incentivize them to try to deliver more of the public goal that you put right in the front of the contract, because they're only paid if they deliver that goal? I think the best, we've sort of simplified it for this discussion, but the best of these contracts, as well as any other category contract your state uses, typically include multiple goals. There might be 10 or 20 performance goals that are in there. You still have minority and women-owned business, job requirements. You have the environmental goals. You might bring in carbon goals side by side with water quality goals. So there's usually a lot of constraints and a lot of demands on whoever's providing it. So it's a pretty subtle difference for this contracting approach, I think, at the end of the day. But what you're basically saying is, look, if you can deliver this outcome that we say we want, that's what we're paying you for. And it shifts the incentive. So everybody's thinking about, that water quality, not thinking about, backhoe operator hours and cost overruns. So I think it's a smaller difference than I think a lot of the literature you're referring to claims. It's not that dramatically different from lots of other contracts, and that there's still, a lot of paperwork and constraints on contractors.
Mr. Chair, can I add one thing to what Tim just said? So wouldn't you say, it seems like to me, with these type of contracts, then you would only attract those who have a higher quality for success, and therefore wouldn't put themselves in a position not to meet the goal, because you're on that deadline, you're on that timeline, and you have to meet those goals. So what I think I'm hearing is that we may end up getting better contractors, more high quality contractors, who hopefully would be submitting the type of plans that would get them to that goal, because nobody doesn't want to not be paid for goals that they say they would meet. But I would say that the process sounds like it would create a little more, not so much of incentive, but it just creates a higher quality of service that would come to these projects, and therefore be delivered more successfully, because you have a higher quality of individuals competing for these contracts. Isn't that so?
That's a fantastic point. And the flip side of it that I'd add is that if the state puts out an RFP and none of those parties think they can deliver it, in other words, it's too risky, they won't bid, and you'll know that it's a bad idea.
Right.
It can't be delivered. That amount or that practice can't be delivered for a price. So it's actually good in terms of just stopping the state from doing things that are really risky in general.
Thanks. Appreciate that.
Good point.
Okay, Delegate Ruth has the last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And actually, so I have a question, but before I get to my question, this whole discussion raised another question for me. So you talked about how the contractor is taking the risk that if they don't perform, then they don't get paid. And in finance, there's a risk and reward balance. You know, high risk loan is a higher interest rate. And so the language around this, it seems to be a language of like investment rather than, my words are failing me. But so I guess my question is, if they're taking greater risk, in the long run, is their income or, the amount that they get likely to be greater than if they weren't absorbing the risk?
Go ahead, you
John.
want to go first, Tim? Or you want me? Well, from the projects I'm familiar with by well-established restoration companies, many of whom rely on investment capital, obviously, is they end up with very competitive prices at the end of the day. And they protect, they on their own put through insurance policies and things like that, they try to protect the capital they've invested, but if they don't deliver the project, they don't get paid. But I've seen quality work done by private sector companies that just seem to be able to get them done more quickly at very good quality, and they stick with them beyond just the construction of like a stream restoration project.
I'm not questioning the quality. I'm just wondering, if a company is absorbing greater risk, why would they prefer this type of contracting, that if they're absorbing greater risk, to a contract where they just get paid?
I see. I think because of the avenue it gives them potentially to move quickly, to do it expeditiously but well. And it's just a growing part of the environmental restoration world through private investors and private restoration companies. Tim, you want to add to that?
A lot of the differences are they're pretty small differences in process, but I think for the companies, and I'm speaking about this sort of secondhand, but we spent a lot of time with these companies during this development of this legislation, as well as some other work that I'd done previously. It's small differences in how the contract process plays out that give them a little more flexibility to implement projects in ways they feel like they're more likely to be able to deliver successfully. So when they're, again, incentivized to pay by the hour on, purely on cost basis, they're incentivized to check with the state on every small detail in terms of process. They generally have a little more flexibility as long as they're going to achieve those outcomes in getting there. And so that flexibility has business value. And all these contracts still have insurance provisions in them. There's bonding, there's various official forms of insurers that are involved. So when there's more risk, like some activities like doing stream restoration in Maryland is pretty common at this point. It's not a super risky thing to do, and the fact that there's lots of engineers and experts in it. Things that are much more risky, like there's a huge dam removal going on in the Pacific Northwest. Mostly it's insurance that's used to handle the really big risk there, as opposed to a huge difference in the price of the contract. Now, there probably is some difference in contract prices when something really is a little bit riskier, when people don't feel confident that they can do it, across multiple projects. But I think it's probably hard to see exactly how much that risk plays into the bid price. And again, just based on the information I'm aware of, all reported to me by state and local government officials across the country, they consistently say, and this is not anyone in Maryland, but an official in another state said, please don't say I said this, but we're saving 50% on what we paid before. for the same kind of work. In this case, it was wetland restoration work. So I think in general, there have been pretty good cost savings for local government in these processes. So that even if there is a little more risk and risk pricing, at the end of the day, the total cost of those contracts is still lower.
Thank you. And so if I could just ask the question I had my hand up to ask. So you say that the applications are prioritized, local job benefits is one of the things that's used in prioritizing which applications to fund. Is there any requirement that those jobs be, say, family sustaining jobs, anything relating to prevailing wage? How do we know that these are good jobs and not just,
I might just comment briefly, and then Tyler or James might want to speak to this, but the list of criteria that were added to the DNR Coastal Bays Trust Fund just lists, after you identify the water quality benefits, what other benefits should be part of the prioritization, and it just lists it as local jobs. But the language as written leaves it up to DNR to decide, how to determine what local jobs would be.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Delegate Boyce, was that your hand up from a previous question? Okay.
Mr. Chair, I just hope that Mr. Griffin and Mr. Mayo will come back again, because I'm sure I will have a lot more questions as we dig into this.
Sure. John and Tim, I take it you'll be available as
anytime, day or night.
All right. Okay. Hopefully it'll be more in the daytime than the nighttime. But thanks for being willing to be available. And thank you to the subcommittee for your consideration of this comprehensive bill and its many parts. And we'll be continuing the conversation on it. And with that, I'll say we are adjourned, and see everyone at our 5:30 voting session.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Mr.
so
Chair,
much.
members of the committee. Very good
Okay.
discussion. Thank you.
Thank you all for your